Good morning, colleagues. Welcome to our sessions. The session is organized by the Progressive Socio-Economic Investment Institute, a trust focusing on public benefit activities. Amongst the activities that the trust is doing is education, health, and socio-economic development. In the area of education, our focus has been to organize webinars dealing with various topics that affect society. The views of the participant in the webinar does not represent the views of the Progressive Socio-Economic Investment Institute. I am facilitating the session as the founder and the trustee of the Progressive Socio-Economic Investment Institute, and my views does not represent the views of any other organization that I might be attached to. My views are purely the views of Progressive Socio-Economic Investment Institute. I wanted to put that disclaimer forward before we can start. Today, our focus will be white supremacy and privilege in South Africa post-1994. There has been some narrative peddles around that there is white supremacy and privilege in South Africa. That happened before 1994 during the apartheid era. But that white supremacy and privilege did not end in 1994. The discussion is that, or the narrative is that, it has been continuing. The whites are still having privileges, and they portray a supremacist behavior towards other races. But what is white supremacy and what is white privilege? Can one discuss white supremacy and privilege without discussing racism? Can one discuss white supremacy and privilege without discussing Black inferiority and lack of privileges? Today, we are so fortunate to have one of the scholars of oppression, Mr. Joe Komane. He is a PhD candidate at Wits University, and he will be focusing on this topic of today. Colleagues, and after that, we'll engage on this topic of white supremacy and privilege in South Africa post-1994. Without a waste of time, I'll hand over to our presenter today, a PhD candidate at Wits University, a scholar of oppression, Mr. Joe Komane. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sediko. I hope that everybody can hear me. By keeping quiet, I would like to assume that I'm audible to everybody. The topic for today is to reflect on the pathology called white supremacy and racial privilege. I am calling them pathology because they are very problematic. It should not be happening in the context of post-apartheid South Africa. In terms of the scope, I would like to set the parameters. I will begin where it all began. I will start by reflecting on an ancient traditional practice of humankind. It is called binary thinking, or binarism, if you prefer. This is the phenomenon that creates or fosters conditions for white supremacy and racial privilege. I will also reflect on the corollary of the phenomenon, white supremacy and racial privilege, which is oppression. Because oppression takes place, is varied, is variegated. This one that we are focusing on is going to be based on race. Hence, we call it racism. And there are two contextual examples that we need to reflect on. In case of South Africa, it is apartheid. And then in case of the US, it is slavery. Both are forms of oppression that takes the racial toll. So both are a classic example of racism. And I'll also look at how in the public discourse, we frame certain notions, the notion of majority, the notion of Black the notion of being democratic as compared to being democratizing. These are very much important tenets of our debate. Why? Precisely because they are a sine qua non for being an intellectual. If you are an intellectual, you need to move beyond the surface and delve deeper into issues of power, issues of privilege and oppression, with the end in mind, which is to create an anti-oppression praxis in which there will be enjoyment of rights and achievement of social justice. The last thing that I will speak about is the antidote. Hence, I have referred to the white supremacy and racial privilege as pathology. It means we need to expose them, confront them, and eradicate them. Hence, I am speaking about the antidote. So it is a mammoth task in the sense that we need to come up with strategic ways of dealing with such pathologies. In terms of the genesis, we need to understand that from time immemorial, human beings have been perceiving and thinking things in terms of opposite extremes. For example, day and night, moon and sun, mind and body, reason and emotions, north and south, east and west, men and women, black and white, to be more nuanced for this particular debate. This binary thinking permeates the society precisely because it influences how people think, behave, and act towards each other. The focus is on difference. I have already argued elsewhere that difference is not problematic per se, but it is how you respond to it or how you use difference. For example, we are all human beings in South Africa, but there are certain human beings that are more superior than others, in this particular case, whites. So white people have used our color, which they said is black, in order to discriminate against that, in order to exploit us, in order to marginalize us, in order to exclude us from the mainstream economic activities. Hence, we have got these effects. Binary thinking fosters conditions for hierarchical assumptions, for values and practices, which make people to take sides. You group people into two groups based on their certain variables, such as color, race, for example. So this one is superior, the other one is inferior. This particular process is called othering. The notion of othering is everywhere where oppression is. I would like to say that it is a cognate of oppression. Othering is the practice of creating them and us. That dichotomy, establishing the self as the norm. So you are saying they are not like us. Black people are not like us. We are superior, they are inferior. So in other words, white people use othering in order to foreground themselves while they were backgrounding us. So they are superior, and then we are morally inferior. One of the Indian scholars called Spivak called it the subaltern. The subaltern, she borrows from Antonio Gramsci, which talks about the subaltern. The subaltern is the member of the inferior rank. It's the lower class person. It's the one who is inferior. It's the one whose culture is pathologized. It's the one who is exploited, who is excluded. It's the one who is experiencing all these negative experiences about interacting with other groups of people in the society. So this othering is an expression of stereotypes, prejudice, and behaviors. As you know very well, stereotypes has to do with the cognition, the mind, how you think about other people. For example, Black people are lazy. That is stereotypical. I dislike Black people. That is prejudicial. When you discriminate Black people in the process of employment, for example, in the corporate world, that is a very practical example. That is discriminatory. The effect of binarism in South Africa, like I've said, is white supremacy and racial privilege. But what is white supremacy and what is racial privilege? Perhaps we need to start with the views from W.B. Du Bois. Du Bois is a sociologist, human rights activist, and his seminal contribution to the United Nations human rights discourse is well known, although in many instances is being grounded because of the color of his skin. W.E. Du Bois. He said the problem of the century, the problem that afflicts humankind is the color line. This manifests itself through white supremacy. White supremacy is where there is a dominant narrative or a discourse on how people think, behave, and act. These are deliberate forms of white domination in order to create inequalities and injustices between white and black people. It is maintained, created, and sustained through power and privilege. These are critical success factors for white supremacy. When we're saying white are superior, it means they control everything. Everything is white dominated. Everything is white centered. Everything is white identified. And most importantly, everything is white controlled. In the South African lexicon or in the public discourse, they talk about white monopoly capital. Perhaps this particular narrative of white monopoly capital is not far-fetched. Why? Precisely because the economy is in the hands of white people. We need to say that unapologetically. And this is not far-fetched. And perhaps the notion of radical economic transformation is either not far-fetched as well, but that would be under the provision that it is well conceptualized and articulated to represent the views of the black people, to dismantle the white privilege, to do away with the white domination. In South African context, this white supremacy and privilege should be understood within a particular socio-cultural, economic, and political context. That is why we need to reflect on colonialism, because South Africa was a victim of colonialism. And we also need to reflect on what followed colonialism, which is apartheid. Colonialism is linked to imperialism. Post-colonial critics will tell you that these are twin concepts. You need to see them through one as theory, the other as practice. Imperialism is the grand idea of taking total control of people's resources, themselves, their minds, their culture, their religion, their wealth, their politics, because that talks to decision making, and resource allocation. That is the theory of imperialism. And colonialism is the action itself. You are actualizing the theory. So that is why theory and practice are very much important. Paulo Freire, in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, talks about the fact that in order to understand our situation, we need to use theory and practice, action and reflection. He talks about praxis. So you do something and you reflect, how am I doing? How am I going to do it better going forward to make yourself better and better in order to address the plight of your people? So that is imperialism and colonialism. By the way, apartheid is a colonialism of a special type, I would argue. Because if you look at apartheid, it's a system which was internalized, institutionalized, narrativized through laws, through policies. And the aim was to ensure that you influence the then discourse, the narrative that black people are inferior and white people are superior. Hence, we are talking about the role of social engineering in order to create, in order to produce, sustain that white hegemony and privilege. And then we need to make sure that in Africa, for example, when we talk about colonialism, it took a racial turn because there were black people. But in Argentina, for example, if Britain was colonizing Argentina, you know, Argentina is full of white people and so are British. So that is not racism. We should not say it is racism. It is called ethnocentrism. It is called ethnocentrism. So we need, also the very important point is to disabuse ourselves from this notion that Black people can be racist. Black people cannot be racist. Why? Precisely because racism was specially designed to maintain white supremacy and Blacks' inferiority. It was implemented and supported and buttressed through various legislation and statutes under apartheid. And the consequences, we are still feeling them here. And we are talking about the relentless consequences of apartheid. The latent effects, it manifests long after it is gone. Don't ever think that apartheid is gone. It has simply gone underground with the arrival of the so-called democracy. I will compromise democracy as time goes by. Privilege. Privilege is the conferring of advantages on one group to the exclusion of the other. And then we need to make sure that it is about systematically conferring upon advantages, benefits or entitlement. They may be physical, material, and psychological. And by the way, privileges, all privileges are advantages, but not all advantages are privileges. There is this thing called an end advantage. That is when you use class, race, gender in order to distribute resources. But when somebody who is a professor, and then being appointed to become the economic advisor of the minister, for example, Professor Chris Mulligan, and then it is not a privilege, it is an end advantage. Remember, privilege is an end. Just because of the color of your skin, just because of your nationality, just because of your gender, that is an end. You did not work for it. It so happened. So this is the wild card to climb up on all individual groups due to their differences. There is this other notion that we also need to dissuade ourselves from when we are conceptualizing majority. How often do I hear people saying that South African Black people are majority? We are the majority, chest beating, being proud. That shows lack of critical insight into the balance of forces and sheer distortion of reality. And I'm not saying numerical majority does not matter. It matters in terms of ascending to political power. It is instrumental for changing the rules of the game. But we must understand that we need to denude the concept of majority of its numbers. It is not a quantitative issue, it's a qualitative issue. The majority in South Africa, I argue, are those who have got power and privilege. Those are the white people. Those are the people who controls the mine. Those are the people who controls the agriculture. Those are the people who are managers in the corporate world. Those are the people who are calling the shots. Those are the pipers. So those are the people who are in majority. We are simply in minority, qualitatively speaking, if context matters. Because we cannot talk about majority and minority without contextualizing them to particular history. Remember, context talks to time and space. These are very important issues that you need to take into account. There are many strategic ways of dealing with white supremacy and racial privilege. Recently, we attended an event at Hilton Hotel. It was organized by Shivera Institute for Research and Development. And then there was an idea of forming a native movement, which is going to be the custodian of thought leadership. The task of that particular movement, of the Black professionals, is to enlighten the unenlightened. Paulo Freire talks about raising consciousness through praxis. Marx will talk about facilitating a shift from being a class in itself to class for itself. That is what the native movement task is to. From an ethical perspective, we should avoid being ivory towers, corrupt business people, and deplorable politicians. these people, or if we play this particular role, it means we are very complicit in the system that is grinding our people. We are complicit in producing white supremacy and racial privilege. And that is not in our advantage. Professor Maliganas talks about creating an overarching vision for the natives. I've never engaged him on why he keeps on using the native, but I want to say that we're using native precisely for a specific purpose. We are deconstructing the common narrative about everything, about the notion of black. Because black is associated with a particular history in South Africa. Being black is associated with a particular role in South Africa. One person said that we are not born black, but we're born into becoming black. We are not oppressed because we were born black. We became black because we were oppressed. So we need to problematize the notion of black. Hence, we are talking about the natives. We were natives before. African National Congress, when it was founded in 1912, it was called South African Native Convention. Natives, because we have got the right to name ourselves. Because if we allow people to name ourselves, they are going to determine our journey, our destiny. That is why they name us black so that they can oppress us. So why the regime used black as a social contract? To put us in our place. So we need to reject that essentializing practice. Because being black is congruent with subordinate role of being the other. But who is the other? What is the other? The other is the one that is exploited. The other is the one that is marginalized, subjugated, excluded, inferior, deceased, their color. This is very much important. Because if you say we are black, black, you are linking it to, you are reproducing those stereotypes, you are reproducing the prejudices, discrimination, you are complicit into maintaining and upholding the white supremacist structure. So we need to deal with that. We need to begin to think about this. We need to make sure that we are critical about these issues because they're linked to issues of power. They're linked to issues of privilege, issues of justice, issues of human rights. These are very much important. And because white supremacy and racial privilege, these are the hallmarks of the post-apartheid South Africa. And another important issue, I often hear people talking about post-apartheid. And I thought perhaps this is very dangerous because it simplistically assumes that post denotes that apartheid is something passé, meaning that it is gone, we should forget about it. But the effects are still here. White supremacy is still here. Racial privilege is still here. Others talk about democratic South Africa. I disagree with that one. I think we need to talk about democratizing because it presupposes that we have reached our destination. We have crossed the bridge. Because democratizing, meaning that we are still dealing with the effects of colonialism. We are still dealing with apartheid, white supremacy, and racial privilege. All these pathologies, we are still dealing with them. That is why we are saying that redress is the way to go. And when we are talking about redress, it is the question of whose ox was God. It is the white people's culture which was honored. Affirmative action, employment equality, equity, mining charter, they are scratching the surface. Actually, they failed to eradicate the white supremacy and racial privilege. After 25 years, there is no system that is in place that is intended to disabuse Black people from white supremacy and disabuse whites from inferiority of Blacks, from thinking that Black people are inferior. And Black people are not inferior. But there are many people who are still thinking that Black people are inferior, even Black people themselves, because there is no system in place, be it in the curricula of our schooling system. There is nothing that disabuses us. Many people still think that whites are superior. That is the social order, because the effects of apartheid and colonialism are far-reaching in terms of scope, in terms of, they are very durable, they are very cumulative. So if that is the case, that is why we are saying the redress. when we are saying letter affirmative action and so on, we need not to be apologetic about those particular. And that is why we need to influence the space. The mining charter. Mining charter talks about ownership. It talks about management. And if you look at the management, the ownership of mine, black people are still in minority, qualitatively speaking. Black people, if you look at the management, I work in the mining sector. If you look at the management, 15%, less than 15% are black people. The chief executive officers of the mines, remember mine is also the cornerstone. It contributes substantially to the gross domestic product of the country. So we need to focus. In agriculture, for example, what happens? What is happening in retail? Have we transformed? Or are we still seeing white supremacy and racial privilege? Are black people inferior, managerially inferior or deficient? Those are the questions that we need to be. And I don't think we are. It's just that there is a system which militates us. Every time we move, and we are expected to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps because these interventions are not working. We cannot pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We cannot control the economy without the policies, without statutes that create conditions for that. In the real sense of the word, meaningfully. I'm not talking about things that are scratching the surface. I'm talking about issues that are at core challenging the existence of white monopoly capital by proxy, white privilege and racial, white supremacy and racial privilege. I have seen the video. There was a video which I saw about the current presidential incumbent. He was talking about what happened after they've concluded the negotiations and the interim constitution was adopted. And apparently they organized an evening party. And then he was very happy that they have won. Isn't that so? They have won. Now they're going to go, they're going to take over the government. They're going to ascend to political power. And then Rolf Meyer, his counterpart, was dancing, he was drunk, he was excited. And then he asked himself, why is this man excited? He should be feeling very bad, precisely because he has lost. And I wish I could tell the president that it is precisely because he knew very well that the Constitution, because we became a constitutional sovereignty, was to maintain the status quo, to maintain the white supremacy and racial privilege. He knew that was his mandate. Go to the negotiations, let them do anything else except to tamper with the relations of economy, structural patterns of ownership. And we have not. 25 years into democracy, we have not done anything. So this constitution, I argue, it maintains and upholds white supremacy. Section 25 talks about property rights. And then if you want to change it, unlike during apartheid when there was a parliamentary democracy, if they want to change certain thing which is going to have far-reaching implications in the society, they go into the parliament, they voted, the Afrikaners say no, very well that it was going to be passed because they are majority in parliament. Today they said no, because blacks are numerically superior, therefore we are not going to create a condition whereby this is going to be potent against us. That is why they said no, not parliamentary democracy. The paradigm shift from parliamentary democracy into constitutional democracy. Every time you want to change the constitution, any provision that is embedded in that constitution, you need to go through certain processes. And negotiations becomes protracted. It becomes a tedious process to such an extent that you won't be able to do that. A classic example is this one of the land, expropriation of land without compensation. We need to refer to the constitution. We are not referring to the majority. Why? Precisely because white people knew that black people are majority numerically in parliament. We are going to change the system. It's not going to be a parliamentary democracy. It's going to be a constitutional democracy. Those are the issues that we need to zoom in, colleagues, and reflect on them, educate people about them. Because many people that don't know these things, we are sitting with information that needs to be dispatched to people. If you want to create a social movement, if you want to create an overarching vision for black people, we need to talk about those particular issues. We need a multi-pronged approach because society is made up of a assemble of institutions that create a particular social order through a particular discourse that influence people's thoughts, their feelings, their actions. Marxists will tell you that South Africa is a capitalist society. In that context, it means in South Africa, we have the haves and the have-nots, the propertied and the propertyless, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. I often ask myself, how will we disrupt white supremacy if we are still engaging capitalism within its own institutional logics? Because there are people who even our leaders in parliament, they don't imagine the end of capitalism without the end of humankind. Marxist feminists will not only talk about class, but they will bring the dimension of gender. To say it's not only about class, it's about gender. Gender and class intersect to create a particular system of oppression on the part of the marginalized. Critical race theories bring the issue of race. So it is gender, it's race, it's class. I can also bring in the issue of age, Mr. Agolote. Where you are working, you will work until you are 60, I think. After that, you are not allowed to work. That is discrimination on the basis of age. It is ageism. But in Parliament, legislators were very wise enough to say that they can work there even if they sleep during important debates until thy kingdom come. All these things implies that South Africa is a pluralistic society. It needs a holistic approach to understanding its challenges, including white supremacy and privilege. We need to mount an influence. There are various domains of the society that are very critical. The first one is the psychological. The psychological, I'm talking about the mind of the people, the citizenry mind, the mind of the citizens, particularly Black people. You need to understand the combination of politics and psychology, that politics influence psychology and vice versa. That is why oppression, which maintains white supremacy, is internalized. When you are internalizing oppression as a Black person, you are internalizing domination, or you are not important, you are inferior. So it hails you as the subject. You know your place. And white people do something different because in oppression, there are two sides of coin. Oppression and privilege are the two sides of the coin. One is their basically. So white people internalize what? Domination. They internalize superiority while you are internalizing inferiority. So we need to start at a psychological level of our people. Our people need to understand that we need to understand that our people are damaged. They are in psychotic condition. If you don't understand that, then that is the problem. We are not going to move. Even our politicians, for many of them, they're very struggling in terms of how to understand oppression. And if you don't understand oppression, that it is an internalized phenomenon. If you don't bring the psychological perspective, then it is a problem. Because when coming to the second facet of the economy of the country, the society, which is important, which is economy, it has to do with distribution of resources. You are not going to distribute resources in order to dismantle white supremacy if you don't understand that oppression is about white supremacy and racial privilege, Black inferiority. And the political is also very much important. And when we're talking about political, there are two, we can delineate two typologies. The first one is the politics with big E. That one is about leadership at the country level. It's about elections, people electing legislators at different tiers of the government system. These are the people who craft statutory mechanisms and policy framework to disrupt the status quo. And there is a politics with small t that happens in the workplace. I watched with interest the issue of the Old Mutual CEO, and I could feel for that Black brother, that native, to say that they did not want him. They simply did not want him, right? They did not want him. I don't know why they did not want him. I don't know his vision, his attitude towards black liberation, but they simply did not want him just because he was black. Nothing else. Not to say that he was incompetent. They wanted to petrolize about incompetence because that is what they always do. And very unfortunately, there were certain people who were black, who were victimizing the very same black person. That is how the system works. They socialize you into believing that black people are not important. And the way in which you treat black people yourself reflects that as well, because you have internalized inferiority in any case. And the another issue is the issue of social. The social has to do with knowing yourself, knowing that you are native, you are self-designed, you are exercising the right to self-naming, not allow others to construct your being in a very limiting way, structurally speaking. This is very much important because we don't know who we are. Why? What happens to our religion? Before the arrival of the missionaries, we were believing in ancestral worshiping. What happens when they came? They said that one. They pathologized our cult, our religion. They said Christianity. Today, when you're talking about Christianity and religion, almost at the same level, and that should not be, because Christianity is only one example of religion. But today, the way in which a discourse, a narrative has been created about it, it is as if it is the only one. And it enjoys superior status. There's no question about that. We don't know ourselves. Because colonialism, for example, one post-colonial critique has abstracted that it did not only plunder African states' resources, it also robbed us of our own identity, because we do not necessarily know ourselves. And you can imagine, if you don't know your identity, how are you going to come up with solutions that are going to address your plight if you don't even know yourself? Start from there. And then in conclusion, Mr. Agulote, I think I have spoken to say that white supremacy, racial privilege has to be understood in context. They were reinforced through colonialism and apartheid, which is a form of oppression. And in order to address those ones, we need to focus on key strategic areas in the society: the psychological, the economic, the socio-cultural, and the political. These are very much important. I shall pause. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Komane, for your submission. It's very informative and also provoking at the same time. You argued that the issue of majority does not necessarily matter when that majority is on the basis of qualitative majority and not, quantitative majority in terms of numbers, and it's not qualitative majority. So the issue of saying the black are in the majority, yes, they're in the majority in terms of the numbers, but in terms of superiority, they are not in majority. In terms of the superiority, because for you to be superior, you should be controlling the economy and the knowledge production of a society. Then you can say you are in majority. That's the summary of your argument, Mr. Komane. And one question, you said you are not black, but you are born black into being black. That's a question that I found from the child. Please unpack that, because it looks like the person who asked you that question did not understand you to say you are not born black, but you have been whatever black. Please explain that, because it needs to be unpacked, the issue of the blackness. We were not we are not oppressed because we are black. We are something like that. I think we missed it. Please unpack it. But without a waste of time, colleagues, those who are part of the webinar and those who are part of our Facebook line, it's time for you to raise questions, comment, and input. And we'll then give Mr. Komane chance to respond. Anyone who wants to raise a question and input? Mohaile Mohashwa, your hand is up, you can go.
Thank you, Dr. Agolotile.
Mohashwa?
Yes, sir. Thank you. The question, well, it's not a question. I want to give the speaker, Mr. Komane, a point. There's a particular point that he got right when he addressed the issue, or when you go to the issue you redress. We have got a lot of work on that particular point, Mr. Komane, and you hit it right on the head right there. And there's an issue of how. You briefly went into the how part, which would be perhaps in the form of education, how adjusting or a total overhaul maybe of our curriculum at schools. But I would like to pick your brains on another point of the how part. We have a situation where we are Africans in Africa trying to live in a Western setting, okay? So what am I saying? I'm saying that we are Black people trying to be white. I see that as the major challenge in how we are trying to resolve the problem. We have got a duty of then abandoning what Africa used to do or what it stood for, and then try to do things the Western way if we are to win in the current war, which I am saying won't work. So what am I saying? In brief, I am saying Africans need to return to their own original setting, which is Africanism, or doing things the African way. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because originally Africans used to dominate the globe. Before Africa was broken apart into pieces and became what it is now. What assisted that process was that Africans had abandoned their own ways. And I feel that, or I think that the return to our very own ways we would simply just eradicate the problem that we have, because then in that sense, we're no longer trying to be white. We are just now building on who we are and how we do things, and then perfecting that with time. That's the point I wanted to throw in for now and leave it there.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mohashwa. We'll go to Mr. Twadi Komane. Mr. Komane Twadi.
Good morning still. Mr. Komane, thought-provoking. I want to raise one issue with the platform. We can postulate, engage, debate about racism, about racial oppression and its consequence. The how part, Dr. Komane, from where I'm sitting, and I want to make a proposition to the forum and to yourself as a presenter. Can we talk at some point about epistemological violence? Because you see, racism is epistemologically embedded. In other words, racism derives from the script, underlying script of knowledge production, of political power, of economic power, of all things that sustains and reproduces racism. So if we were to deal with it, because it's a violent, slavery was very violent. Colonialism was also very violent. There was annihilation of human life and gunpowder and all manner of violence that created conditions for racism to be sustained as it is now. If we are going to deal with it, I would want to pick on you, Dr. Komane, to perhaps share your thought on epistemological violence. In other words, you're not going to deal with racism through singing Kumbaya and hugging each other. We need to understand racism and how it's founded and what are its roots. And if you're going to deal with it, it means you must uproot it epistemologically. But that is a very violent process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Twadi Komane. Any colleagues who wants to say something before we can allow Mr. Komane to comment? Okay, Mr. Mkhaile, I'll come back to you. Can you put down our hands? Let's allow Mr. Joe Komane to respond. Please don't forget the first question about unpacking that the submission that we're making about being born black, we are oppressed because of black, something like that. Over to you, Mr. Komane.
Thank you very much, Rakulot. I think that particular maxim talks to the fact that the word black is a social construct. I'm sure those who align themselves to postmodernist tradition would agree with me that it is socially constructed. So if it is socially constructed, it means it can be deconstructed as well. Hence, I am saying to refer ourselves as black is to constrain ourselves. But if we have take into account the fact that we have got the right to name ourselves constitutionally speaking, therefore we can say we are natives, because that is what we are. Natives are the original inhabitants of this country, if not the continent. So this is something which is very much important. And if you are saying you're black, remember black, it is what part of the epistemological violence which was meted out against black people, to name them so that you are able to link them with a particular narrative, and also a subordinate role in the society, so that you can be exploited. So that is something which it talks about, how part of it, which is very much important. And then because epistemological violence, remember epistemology has to do with ways of knowing. And then the way in which the knowledge was produced in such a way that it disadvantaged black people. It excludes them from certain paradigms and so forth. So this is something which is very much important. Like, for example, we were made to believe that to be black, we are born black. We did not become black. We were born black. And therefore, that is linked to the role that we play in the society and the status which is inferior. So we need to deconstruct that. We need to attend to other meanings. The reader talks about deconstruction of the text in order to make sure that we are dismantling its logocentric, its meaning, to find other meanings which are embedded in that particular discourse as well. So hence I'm talking about the internalized nature of oppression. The fact that if it is internalized, it means oppression does not only depend on external controls, it also builds into the minds of the group, the targeted groups, subservience. So that is where we need to go. We need to go to the mind. Hence, Steve Biko has said the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Because that presupposes when you have taken control of the person's mind, it means you control the cognitive, the affective, and the behavioral dimensions of that particular person. So that is where we need to make sure that we begin with, I would argue. And of course, therefore, at the political level, we talked about the fact that there must be policies that are crafted in order to ensure that issues of redress or restitutionary programs, taking into account who was exploited, who is exploited, dismantling the systematic, the past and the current disadvantage. So that is what we need to do. And of course, if you look at oppression, racism as form of oppression, it intersects with other forms of oppressions. We need intersectional understanding. Otherwise, if we don't deal with it holistically and in an integrated manner, therefore we are not going to be successful. Because there is this issue of age, there is this issue of sexual orientation, as well as the issue of gender. Those are other forms of oppressions. All of them, there is a monster with many heads. The monster is oppression. Many heads are classic forms, how it manifests itself at different levels, depending on the context and so on and so forth. And then I hope that I have addressed every question. And then I would like to reiterate the importance of how part of it. The how part of it is very much important. Theory and practice, action and reflection. That is something which is very much important. Precisely because, but we should not assume, because that is simplistic, that people understand what oppression is all about, what white supremacy is all about. I have listened, I have watched many people articulating this particular issue. I thought maybe they do not necessarily understand it enough to engage it, because we need to fully grasp what is it all about before we can come up with interventions to dismantle or eradicate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Komane. Can we go for other hands input?
We cannot hear, Ragulot.
I think now I've lost my
Ragulot, we cannot hear. I cannot hear myself. Let me speak for myself.
Can you hear? Can you hear me? I think I've lost the speaker. I've lost my speakers. Hello?
Yeah, speak aloud.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. I can hear you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm saying, let's take other hands. According to Twadi, his question around violence is not being addressed. We'll allow Twadi to come back again to maybe simplify the question so that it can be addressed. Mogashwa, you can come in.
Okay, yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Joe, I want to get your view on an instance where you have got a ruling party that is made up majorly by humans from the disenfranchised group. But they don't use that power to turn the tables around. What do you think leads to that type of behavior or practice? I don't know what particularly to call it, but what do you think leads to a situation where people have got what you could refer to as power to change things, but they do not do it? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mukhaila. We'll go back to Mr. Twadi Komane to repeat his question, because it looks like his question was not answered. Mr. Twadi Komane, and other colleagues, please feel free also to engage and to avoid a situation where only about 2-3 people are engaging on this matter. Mr. Twadi Komane?
Chairperson, if I were to get back to the question, you see, for me, we agree firstly, that the racial template, that racism is embedded in knowledge creation. And I think Mr. Komane has elaborated on that path, that what we know, how we conceive ourselves, even including us imagining ourselves as Black, the imagining process is based on knowledge production. And that knowledge production is a process that is founded, for example, in terms of your curriculum, your social agency, institutions of socialization. All of these things support and enhances the racial template. Now, my question is, if I was to put it differently, to arrive at that point where the knowledge, institutions of knowledge production like universities and the kind of knowledge that they produce has become what it is, which is what we already agree, is because there was a violent process to get to that point. Yeah? Slavoj Zizek speaks of In Defense of Lost Causes is the book, where he says the people, those that are able to have the agency to unravel the system must be outside the system. In other words, the poor and the downtrodden who have got nothing to lose have got the agency and the ability to unravel the system when you talk about capitalism. When you talk about racism, I think the previous speaker spoke about the ruling party and the elites in the ruling party. The elites are not going to, because they're already part of the system, they're not going to assist us. The proposition I'm making, Chair, in concluding the point, is that racism is a very violent process. It's brutal, but also very gentle once people have submitted. So it requires submission on the part of the oppressed. So if the oppressed have submitted to the institutions of racism and its embeddedness, then there's no problem. The problem starts when you don't submit to the template of racial oppression, because you then get to be defined outside the system. But for you to engage the system, you can only use violence. And that is war. Like, racism came out of wars. There were wars which were fought. People died. Slavery was not a very peaceful process. If you follow the history of slavery from the West Coast of Africa, Western Africa, and how the processes in terms of how slaves were captured, how they moved, that thing was very violent. Now you're sitting here now in the aftermath. The question I'm raising is, and I'm asking this specifically, what if this thing is embedded in violence? How do we unravel it without being violent? And if we are going to be violent, what does that take? And what does it mean? I'm hoping I'm making sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Twadi. What you are saying is that racism is a product of violence. And for you to remove it, you can remove it through applying soft gloves. So there is a need for some elements of violence to remove a violent product. So you can't fight fire you must fight fire with fire. That's the national word of you are saying. Mr. Komane?
I see the point. It says violence. And violence is one of the faces of oppression. We do agree, along with marginalization, exploitation, and so forth. And then in order to deal with it, he is saying that violence should be one of the options. I'm not so sure about that one. But I think there are many ways of dealing with the issue of racism, as I've already alluded to the fact that we need to start at the psychological level, a psychopathological perspective, in order to deal with the mind, notwithstanding the fact that it was also enforced through violence means externally. But what I'm saying because now we have got the luxury of political power. And then if we appreciate the instrumental value of it, because Black people are in power, but those particular Black people, maybe they are members of the bourgeoisie to maintain the status quo. But if you appreciate, we use the political power that we are having as Black people in order to advance the betterment causes of Black people, then that would be. But in terms of violence, meeting violence with violence, I'm not so sure about that one, but I think there are many ways of dealing with skinning this and killing a cat in a sense. And I do acknowledge the fact that there was knowledge production is implicated in issues of power and privilege, of course. That is why Black people were inferiorized along the process of knowledge production. Hence, they were deemed to be managerially incompetent or morally pathological and so forth. So I do agree with that one. But on the issue of violence, I think there could be other ways, and we need to take into account the fact that this is a constitutional democracy. And then if we have to adopt violence, it is outside the constitutional prescripts of the country. But there are so many people may suggest many things, but I think we need to start at the level of the mind. And then, because if Black people are exposed to violence, they were abused. Violence is very abusive, and its effects are very clear. We are sitting here in the aftermath of those ones. The repercussions are very clear. Violence, you see violence everywhere. Violence has been normalized. It has been naturalized as if it is natural for a person to be violent and so on and so forth. And I know that frustration aggression theory talks about the fact that if people are very frustrated, they're likely to be aggressive. And that is what comes out of that. What comes out of that is violence. And then, yeah, I think we can allow other people to make other suggestions. And then I do acknowledge the fact that violence was one of the weapons. Hence, the armed struggle, if you look at the armed struggle, was a sheer or implicit acknowledgement of the fact that apartheid was violent. That is why we spoke about its equivalent, which is armed struggle, in order to counteract that particular system as well. But the context matters if we take into account where we are now, and then talk to issues of violence and juxtapose the current situation with violence as a means to an end, then yeah.
Thank you so much, Mr. Komane. Any other inputs from other colleagues before we close? Before we close, Mohaila will go for the last time, then we'll close.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. In response to this, I don't want to call it a proposition or suggestion, but maybe view that we can only undo what has been done through violence. It is not the best option that is on the table. It is, yes, one of many. But if there's 50, say I'm giving off the cuff figures here. If there's 50 million people in a crawl, let's call South Africa a crawl. And in the 50 million, 40 are the oppressed humans. And then the 10 million are the supposed oppressors. It is very clear that you don't even need violence in that type of a setting. All you need is what you can call a political will, or the will from the people. People must be willing to change their own circumstance or condition to be able to maneuver this type of a setting. We can get violent now and kill all the white people, or whatever violence means to the speaker. But will that then change our condition? Because I don't believe that in this point in time that we are being oppressed as Black people or being marginalized. Because then we're going to ask you to explain what oppression is. How does one person oppress another? you know. But in summing it up, there's a lot about the problem than we understand. To say that we must use violence to free ourselves. I mean, I would like to think that we are free, and there are just some administrative issues in place that needs to be attended to. Violence, no, not in the current equation. It's not going to help anyone. My view, and I would like to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mohashwa. Twadi, be the last one, and on the issue of violence and other issues that you want to raise. Be the last one, Twadi, because your hand is up.
Thank you, Chair. Let me give an example so that we don't become trivial in talking about epistemic violence, because we need to be conceptually grounded and also be conceptually clear. You see, the Rose Must Fall movement in the at UCT was an example of epistemic violence. You see, nobody was killed in the Rose Must Fall movement, but what happened is we had a statue of Cecil John Rhodes at an institution of higher learning that represented oppression and all things horrible in the past. But that statue stood at the center, at a very central place where the students and those who were moving around were coerced and if you like brutally marshaled into submission, that they are part of what Rhodes stood for. Now those young men and women, they spoke. I mean, how do we have a symbol of racism as brutal as Susan Rhodes being physically there that you see every day, while you're talking Fanon and you're talking all other critical literature and so forth? Practically, where you are, there's a symbol of the root or whatever. Now the stage of Rhodes fell physically, so it was a physical process for me, but it's very violent. The University of Cape Town was not going to agree to take off the statue. They were going to say, let's build another statue next to it and explain it in some fanciness. So I'm not talking about killing people. I'm talking about being practical. Name, for example, we are a country called South Africa. What does that mean? If we are Black and Africans and we are here, let's agree based on the quantitative numbers we have to say this country is not South Africa. It can't be. It's not a direction. So those things would require some level of of not authority, because we don't have authority, but some level of us insisting. So if the insistence on Komane and Mohashwa and others, we can't have a place called Marble Hall, where I come from. It means nothing. If 98% of people who are there cannot relate to the name, why can't we change it? So names that we use of the country, of simple things, of the symbols around us, that is where, because remember that epistemology is about knowledge production. If I'm now in Cape Town, right? But what does Cape Town mean? The people who were displaced here, the Khoi and the San, have got a rightful, legitimate claim to this place. But if you can't entertain it, and if you're going to entertain it, how do you do so? So for me, the fees must fall, the rose must fall, the South African name, the national anthem. How do you have an anthem where the Bantu part of the anthem talks about God, and the Afrikaans part talks about the land? These are simple things, and I'm saying we need to be insisting. We can't. And when I say epistemic, it's about knowledge. So the national anthem must be revisited. We must say the anthem must reflect us and the land. We spent 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which we should do. But let's also have 16 days on the land question. So that when we talk about gender violence, gender-based violence, and we address these issues, we also equally as society deal with the land question. and that the land question is avoided. We talk about everything else except the land. That for me is the epistemic violence that is required. We need to insist. We need to be resolute and upfront about the things that defines us. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you so much, Ndadethu Komane. Your argument is that there is a destructive violence and there's a constructive violence. And these two forms of violence were used to dispossess the natives. Therefore, we should identify between these two forms of violence, one violence that we can use to ensure that the marginalized, which are the natives, gain over their power. And you've argued that we should focus on constructive violence. And you gave an example of the roads must fall. It was not a physical violence where people were beaten and buildings were burned, but it was a concerted or well-structured protest until that statue was removed. We can take an example of that and say, why can't we deal with economic violence against us? By withholding our own resources and buy black. If we are majority in the country in terms of numbers, we stop buying from institutions that are not supporting the cause of the natives. And focus in buying where the owners and the managers and who control the systems and structures of those institutions are the natives. If you want to go and buy, for instance, a car, you must go to a dealership that is owned by a native. If you want to go and buy a bread, you must go to a bakery that is controlled by a native. If you want to go buy clothes, you go to a shop that is controlled and owned by a native. Withdraw your economic power. And that's the other way of unleashing economic violence to the system for it to collapse. I'll give it over to Ndate Komane, Joe, to wrap up and we'll close. Joe, Komane?
Thank you very much. I think thanks for the input. They're very informative, very incisive as well. And then I think one point which was emphasized was the pragmatic part of it. How do you go about dismantling the white superiority paradigm? And then it's all about sparking a social movement, a movement of natives that are aware, that are critical, that understand the balance of forces, that articulate the position of Black people without being apologetic. That is something that we need to do. And then I don't need to waste time. I think all points were taken care of. And then I would like to thank you for this opportunity as well. Let us continue engaging. I'm sure, Tagulot, you're going to call upon people to submit, to raise their hands in terms of addressing certain topics that that might be brought forward.
Okay.
Because these issues are interlinked, they're interwoven, so they all form part of the social fabric of the society. So the main idea, whatever the ideology, is to better the lives of Black people, is to dismantle, to expose, confront, and transform the racial, gender, and class relations in the society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Joe Komane, for coming to present to us. Thanks, colleagues, for engaging Mr. Komane. If really we want to win the war against the white supremacy and privilege, we must raise the conscious of the unconscious and make them conscious. We must ensure that at least in your daily life, make sure that you raise the conscious of the unconscious to make that unconscious conscious. Even if you can touch one, you will have done the Lord's work. Just one per day. Make the unconscious conscious. When people are conscious themselves, they will lead the struggles to liberate themselves. You will not need a lead or someone else to come and lead them. when they are conscious themselves in the way they're doing things, the way they're thinking, they will lead the struggle to liberate themselves. Ours as a progressive socio-economic investment institute trust, we are in the process of raising consciousness. Colleagues, we will be having another discussion tomorrow at 6 o'clock. We'll be focusing on political interference versus political intervention in the public service. There has been some outcry that politicians are interfering in the running, in the administration, and others are arguing that it's not interference, but it's intervention. So we'll be having that discussion tomorrow at 6 o'clock. It will be presented by the Deputy Speaker of the Eastern Cape Provincial Legislature, the Honorable Mlibo Koshian. So I'm encouraging you to come and join so that we can unpack this topic of political interference versus political intervention. With those words, I want to thank you for your time and looking forward to meet you. And those who are having suggestions in terms of topics, please drop those suggestions in the chat box. Looking forward to meet you in tomorrow's session when we are looking at the political interference versus political intervention. Have a lovely afternoon. Thank you so much. Have a good day.